let's get started. So we're here for Constitution Day, which is September the 17th. And we're doing it today in honor of September the 17th. There'll also be a separate event on September the 17th, if you're interested in knowing, which will be a recording of this program, so you can see it again. So I'd like to thank we got some funding this year from the Jack Miller Center in Philadelphia. The Honors College is sponsored, the library committee of the librarians help us, and also the political science department. We're all sponsored together, so thanks everyone for help. So today we have Dr. Benjamin Kleinerman. I met Ben at Michigan. We were teaching at Michigan State together, and he had just become famous in the world of political science. He published a criticism of George Bush's questionable constitutional decisions in Iraq and Afghanistan, but not from the left and not from the right, but from a kind of deep sort of understanding of living in a republic that's constitutional but also popular and working out what Congress or the president should have done. And so since then, I've come to UNT, and Ben has become really famous. He's now the R.W. Morrison professor at Baylor University. He's also, this semester, he's also a visiting professor at the School for Civic Leadership at the University of Texas at Austin. And so today, he's going to talk on the crisis presidency, and so give Ben a hand of applause.
Thanks, Rafe, and thank you all for coming and for. It's the Honors College hosting me, yes.
Honors College Science and Library, yeah.
And for Jack Miller for paying for this, also helping to fund this talk. I've never been to this university before, so I'm excited to. So I've been to Denton to see Rafe, but never to even into that bar downtown. Riff Rocks or something. Anyway, all right, I want to start with, I'm going to be showing two videos along the way. And the reason I show videos, you'll see they're partisan. The point isn't the partisanship. The point is to show you something about the way we think about the presidency. The way commercials are made when they're trying to become president says something about the way we think about the presidency. And you'll see that's the main point of my talk, is to think through what the president is in our constitutional republic and how we as a people respond to it, how we think about it. So, show that first one.
Those who are lost now, they're ready to must see our lives. I am dispatching housing, so we dominate the streets. I won't trap you fear and division. I won't fan the flames of hate. Your head, we're up. This is the United States of America.
I think my favorite thing about that video was seeing Joe Biden run. Long time ago. All right, so before President Trump took office back in January, he first had to stand before the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and swear an oath. The oath is specified by the Constitution itself. Y'all got your pocket constitutions as that? Article 2. Article 2, very bottom of Section 1, you can look at it. Before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. Quote, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Before he took the oath, Trump was just a man. After he took the oath, he becomes president. The oath, I'd say more than anything else, signifies and marks the transition into the office itself. It's literally the first thing you do as president. As soon as the oath is over, he's become president. Prior to that, he hasn't. Amazingly, the Constitution specifies nothing about the required oaths for members of Congress or even for members of the Supreme Court. By statute and tradition, these people do take oaths before they assume the office, but it isn't prescribed by the Constitution itself. The Constitution only specifies an oath for the presidency, for the president. And looked at the character of this oath. Members of Congress and members of the Supreme Court take an oath, quote, to support and defend the Constitution, unquote. That is, they take an oath essentially only to follow the Constitution, to support and defend it. The president, by contrast, takes an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Although supporting and following the Constitution is certainly implied by those words, something different is being asked of presidents by compelling them to take this specific oath. They must do more than merely support the Constitution. They must preserve, protect, and defend it. The Constitution specifically assigns to them a kind of preservative role that it assigns to no one else. In the first place, preserving, protecting, defending the Constitution may require actions that aren't specified by the Constitution itself. Whereas the legalistic behavior of legislators and judges can basically follow constitutional rules, the preservative nature of the office of the presidency requires discretionary actions that necessarily can't be prescribed in advance. As presidents do everything from negotiate treaties, conduct wars, and manage crises on domestic soil, they must be able to make discretionary and energetic decisions that can't be anticipated or controlled for in the laws. Abraham Lincoln goes even further. In his interpretation of the Constitutional oath, he understood this oath as giving him the authority, for the sake of the preservation itself, even to violate some laws that stood in the way of that preservation. In other words, preservation has to trump even the law itself. If the primary duty is fulfilling the oath, then you have to set aside laws if they get in the way of preserving the Constitution. Presidents then cannot pretend that they have fulfilled the oath if they have let the Constitution crumble, even as they have obeyed its dictates. So this preservative character of the presidential oath arises, I'd say, from the founders' understanding and expectation of the presidency within the constitutional order. They were extraordinarily aware that all republics, prior to this one, had suffered from a number of fatal diseases. If you read the Federalist Papers, it's hard to find anywhere that's more critical of past democracies. They don't form this democracy thinking it's going to succeed. They form this democracy knowing that democracy is dead. They fail everywhere. They have failed everywhere. They're failing at the state level, etc. So they form it, and among the most important of these fatal diseases was their aversion. Republics' fatal diseases was their aversion to a strong executive. Describing both this Republican aversion and the response necessary, in Federalist number 70, Hamilton writes, quote, "There is an idea which is not without its advocates, that a vigorous executive is inconsistent with the genius of Republican government. The enlightened well-wishers to this species of government must at least hope that the supposition is destitute of foundation, since they can never admit its truth without at the same time admitting the condemnation of their own principles." And this is, I think, the critical point. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. Not just in Republican government, not just in monarchies, but all governments need energy in the executive. On their own, republics tend to be aimless, listless, and scattered. as had already been reinforced by the failures of the state legislatures prior to the formation of the Constitution. Legislative assemblies lacked the energy and decisiveness to guide republics through the various unforeseen events that inevitably plague all societies, and which need a speedy and decisive governmental response. The founders used the word energy to describe the virtue necessary for this response. For instance, when Shays' Rebellion breaks out in Massachusetts, not only was the legislature powerless to do anything, the legislators themselves, many of them were participating in the rebellion. By contrast, after the formation of the Constitution, when a rebellion breaks out in Western Pennsylvania, the president of the new union, George Washington, marches a massive number of troops out there to crush the rebellion, sends them all out to Western Pennsylvania, basically crushes the rebellion out there. These two rebellions, Shays, which takes over the whole of Massachusetts and sends it all into chaos, and Whiskey, where there just ends up being a few rebels who kind of slink away in the night because they've been crushed by Washington, I'd say form a kind of bookends around the question of executive power in the new Constitution. The Constitution was formed partially on the basis of the failure of executive power in Shays' Rebellion. By crushing the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington proves the usefulness and essentiality of this new strong executive. Given the supposed Republican aversion to a strong executive, it's interesting how quickly the American people fell in love with this institution, and in a way continue to be in love with this institution. Perhaps because it was first occupied by the hero of the Revolution, George Washington, they seemed to embrace this institution much more than Hamilton worried they would. I'm not sure any of the founders, or many of the founders, some of them did, but appreciated the possibility of a kind of representative executive. That is, they assumed that legislators were deliberative representatives of the people's wishes, and executives were sort of monarchical agents of stability that represented the monarch's interest in a stable country. On this model, the people cared only about representation, and that's what represented in the legislature, and the monarch cares only about stability, and so occupied the executive office. You have these two branches. One represents the people and cares only about representation. The other cares about stability. Within this model, the executive, even if necessary, must always be limited because it conflicts with the representative principle of government embodied by the legislature. That's the model Hamilton's referring to when he says there's this old-fashioned Republican aversion. But I'd say some of the Federalists at the founding came to see that the executive power, as it exists within the presidency, could be more than that. It's empowered with the proper authority and elected in a popular manner, it could represent the people's executive concerns. And because just as the people want a legislature that represents their legislative needs and ambitions, so too they want an executive that represents their executive concerns. And so what do I mean by the executive concerns? A democratic people still wants safety and stability from their government. It's not just the monarchs that want safety and stability, it's also the people that want safety and stability. Most people don't want troublesome rebellions that threaten their liberties and their property. Most people want to feel secure knowing that their government will keep them secure. In other words, at its core, the presidency represents a new Republican option. The possibility that you could represent the people's concern for stability and security within the Republican government itself. The executive could be popularly elected because the people are also concerned with the kinds of things that an executive does. Instead of simply giving the people a legislature to accommodate what might be called their legislative concerns, while having a king impose order and stability on them, a representative executive could actually arise from the people's own concern for order and stability. To achieve this representation, Publius teaches the people, Publius, the author of the Federalist Paper, or the pseudonym for the authors of the Federalist Paper, teaches the people to expect it of their presidents. On questions of stability, security, and even prosperity, the people should expect the executive power to seek these things. Understood in this light, this Publius seems to engage in something of a pedagogical project to teach the people to hold their presidents responsible for representing the people's executive concerns. Whereas they should hold their legislators responsible for representing the people's interests in the laws that they pass, they should hold their presidents responsible for representing the people's interests in having a secure and stable society. And because, if you read Federalist 51, emphasizes the interest of the man will be connected to the constitutional rights of the place, presidents would be motivated to fulfill that responsibility, motivated to keep us secure and keep us stable. Their interest in the specific question of re-election and the more general motivation for greatness would lead them to be the executives that the constitutional union needs. Once we understand the founders' aims in this sense, we can then judge the founding and our own time from a different perspective. Were the founders successful in their project to transform the executive into a representative of the people's executive concerns? Were they successful in making executive power compatible with Republican government? Because they were trying to educate the public, even as they were also trying to persuade them, we can use the founders' arguments to extract their constitutional aims. So again, the founders expected the presidency to provide the stability and security that republics of the past had lacked. By making them unitary actors, that is, one president, not multiple, but one president, they could assign them clear responsibility for that security, partially through the oath itself. Everyone knows who to blame if security collapses. There's one person to blame if security collapses. The challenge is, however, that given the nature of ambition, presidents would only feel compelled to fulfill that responsibility if the people hold them to it. That is, to be constitutional in the way that the founders intended, the people must possess this constitutional instinct. That is, to hold the presidents responsible for keeping us secure and stable. Do we judge presidents by that ultimately? So now I'll turn then, with that question in mind, to our current situation, because in a way I think we continue to remain a constitutional people insofar as we judge presidents most, I think at the end of the day, by how well they handle crises. And perhaps as importantly, how well they make us feel that they can handle crises. And the latter is as much rhetorical as it is factual. In this way, I think the people actually judge presidents most. My argument is the people actually judge presidents most by how well they handle crises. Like Trump doesn't get reelected, I think, in 2020 to the COVID crisis. People held him responsible for not dealing well with COVID. In this way, I think we as a people might be, in a certain sense, smarter than the so-called experts. That is, whereas the experts talked about the president's legislative intentions, the people are most judging them by their crisis capabilities. And this is why I think these commercials can be helpful. Insofar as they are trying to move the people, they show us something about our expectations. So show the next one.
Der Kolonialisten schon verlegen. For months, the threats grew bigger. The warning signs became more ominous. The alarms flashed red. And there was our president, unprepared, indecisive, frozen, paralyzed by this fear of offending the Chinese government and using this precious trade. Amazed the thought the stock market crashed to beat his re-election. So he failed to act, and the virus got out of control and shut down the nation and crushed the economy. Now, nearly 100,000 have died. 13 million unemployment claims and rising. In this crisis, Donald Trump wasn't the president he'd appear in the headlines. too scared to act, too angry to tell the truth, to be the leader. A president who can't handle a crisis is no president at all.
So that last president who can't handle a crisis is no president at all. That's almost literally the argument to my book. So I wasn't involved in making the commercial, but I wish I had. Because I think it says, in other words, that the definition of the presidency is somehow the ability to handle crises. And so, well, as I'll try to illustrate that with a few other presidents as I go. We need a president partially because crises are a kind of permanent part of politics, and we need an institution capable of handling them. And in that way, presidents who fail at handling them can't get reelected. The Constitution has, in a way, succeeded. We as a people are then looking for the right type of presidents who can handle crises. As one piece of evidence for this success, one of the best predictors for presidential approval ratings, either going higher or lower, is how well the people think they've handled a crisis, or how well they think they could handle a crisis. The people want their presidents to make them feel secure by seeming like they could handle serious crisis if it arose. When presidents succeed in making them feel secure, they are popular and typically reelected. When presidents make them feel insecure, they're unpopular and typically don't get reelected. And I'd say this feeling of security is almost entirely mediated by rhetoric. But to see this, I'd say I want to turn back to what I'd call the kind of oath-like character of crisis rhetoric. The rhetoric arises as much from what they do as from what they say. Returning to Washington's crushing of the Whiskey Rebellion, this was actually critical for the people of Western Pennsylvania. They were materially threatened by rebellion in their midst. In other words, they were literally unsafe. By crushing the rebellion, Washington actually makes those people safe. But for the rest of the country, the crisis is symbolic rather than factual. A rebellion in Pennsylvania has no real effect on Massachusetts or something. They aren't actually threatened by a rebellion in western Pennsylvania. Instead, they're threatened by the possibility of rebellions in their midst, especially if this one isn't crushed. If they know their president isn't capable of or willing to crush a rebellion, they won't feel secure. In hearing about Washington's crushing the Whiskey Rebellion, everyone else also feels more secure. In other words, that's the rhetorical character of presidential power. It's partially about what this says about the president and the way in which we're more secure because of what it says about the president. To the extent that the president's successful foreign policy brings them more popular support, it's following something of the same dynamic. Foreign policy crises throughout the world do not materially affect the American people. When they see their president act energetically and decisively in response to international crises, they'll feel more confident in the president's executive virtues and thus their ability to keep them safe. With the exception of long-standing military involvements like those in Vietnam or Iraq, foreign policy is rhetorical, I'd say, in that the people respond to what it says about their president more than that it actually materially threatens them. Thus, for instance, I would suggest that Bill Clinton was able to recover his reputation and authority in his second term by engaging in so many limited wars in the former Yugoslavia. You're all too young to remember this, but there was just sort of a series of small wars in the former Yugoslavia. And whereas by 96, when he was reelected, he'd become, just barely reelected, become sort of seemed not all that presidential. By the time he's out, at the end of his term, he seems presidential. And I think he seems presidential because he was engaging in all this foreign policy. Clinton projects strength and decisiveness. Presidential action signals to the people something about the president's character. This means that presidents are sometimes unpopular even if they are engaged in are sometimes popular even if they are engaged in relatively unpopular wars. For instance, even as the Iraq War grew increasingly unpopular, Bush was reelected in 2004 and continued to enjoy high approval ratings. Even if the war seemed misguided, at least he had the energy and decisiveness to engage in it. Of course, this isn't true of all wars. Depending on how the president manages the war, the people take away different impressions of their character. You go back to Vietnam, LBJ didn't seem energetic and decisive in his handling of the Vietnam War. Instead, he seemed overwhelmed and uncertain about how to proceed in that war. A good example of rhetorical character of presidential crisis action would be Carter's handling of the Iran hostage crisis. The American people themselves weren't threatened by the taking of hostages on the other side of the world. In the initial days after the hostages were seized, Carter's approval ratings improved as the country looked to him to symbolize the strength and decisiveness only presidents are capable of in crises like this. Instead of taking action, however, Carter just talked about pursuing talks with Iran and negotiating a settlement. There's a lot of talk about talking. The nation grew frustrated with this lack of action and failure to find a resolution to the crisis. I actually spent some time in the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library where they save all the old letters people write to the president. And it's amazing how many said something like, you're doing a lot of talking, all we want you to do is act. We want you to do something. And as a sign of this, his approval ratings rebound temporarily for a period of time after the disastrous failure of his rescue attempt in Iran. He tries to send some helicopters in to save people. It's an abject failure. They just crash and nothing happens. But the fact he did it actually made his approval ratings rebound for a period of time. At least he was doing something. Presidential reactions to weather crises are also rhetorical in their effects on the American people. As popular as Bush had been during his first term because of the decisiveness of his response to 9/11, his second term suffered a significant setback after his failed response to Hurricane Katrina. As the waters surged over New Orleans, the country watched and waited for some kind of federal response. Instead of demonstrating decisiveness and energy in response to a situation that seemed to call for these presidential virtues, the president did very little. Although it might have been difficult for him actually to get on the ground and do anything, he instead releases a photo of him looking down on the destruction helplessly and unenergetically from Air Force One. It's probably one of the worst presidential photos ever released. He's looking out Air Force One. You can barely see the destruction below. He looks sad and kind of helpless. And he let this photo be. I should have shown them the photo. It's a kind of public relations disaster for him because this is not what you want to look like when there's a flood raging below you. And I don't think it's that the country literally thought he could stop the flood. They just wanted to see he was trying to do something, not just look down from above. The activity itself might be enough to make us feel more secure that we have a president energetic enough to keep us secure. In other words, the weather crisis, what we're looking for is just activity, decision, energy, so that we feel more secure if something happens to us, there'll be someone who responds energetically and decisively. And in that way, by merely looking out the window on the destruction below, Bush fails not only himself, he fails the American people. The rhetorical nature of presidential action is important not just for the president's own popularity, it's important for that, but it also, I think, is part of what it means to fulfill the oath. When presidents have acted energetically and decisively, they make the American people feel more secure. They're fulfilling their responsibilities as president, even when the security is more a matter of feeling than of being. presidents are meant to have a kind of settling effect on our politics. When presidents seem indecisive, like Carter in the late 70s while he was president, we all feel more insecure, everything seems more dangerous. We want presidents to seem like they can make us secure. And that's not only good for the president's popularity, it's also essential to the president's responsibility to make us feel secure in that way. In emphasizing then the rhetorical nature of presidential action, it also points us to rhetoric itself. Consider, for instance, Bush's success after 9/11. It wasn't that he stopped the attack, or even that he stopped what might have been subsequent attacks. His successful response to 9/11 arose entirely from his rhetoric. When he stood on top of the rubble of the World Trade Center and declared that the terrorists would hear from all of us soon, that first video showed a little clip of it, he displays energy and decisiveness in the speech itself. He unifies the country around himself through a rhetoric that emphasizes action in response to the attacks. Bush's post-9/11 popularity arises from the success of his rhetoric. And by such strong rhetoric, he made us all feel more secure at a time when we all felt profoundly insecure because of the attacks that had just happened. Of course, the vigorous rhetoric had to be followed by real action, which was the attack on Afghanistan. Energetic talk must, in some ways, at some point, be followed by energetic action. And then, I'd say finally, if we consider presidential crisis response through this rhetorical lens, we can make more sense of the perception that Trump failed in his COVID response. Decisive, vigorous, and unifying rhetoric had to precede and then accompany whatever was done in response. Whatever the Trump administration may or may not have done in its response, he never gave that speech, which would have indicated his energetic response and his interest in unifying the country around and through the crisis. Instead, we got press conferences, which were supposed to be about the response, but seemed chaotic and disorganized. And so as a contrast, during COVID, Queen Elizabeth gave this short speech was basically like, the British people, we're going to come together and get through it. And it went viral in social media. It's not a great speech. You're just the thing everyone could say, we're going to come together and get through it. Trump would never give that speech, would refuse to give that speech that would bring us together around and through the crisis. I'd say also, the popularity of Andrew Cuomo's press conferences during COVID indicates something, because again, he just seemed decisive and he was trying to unify, whereas Trump was like yelling at reporters. In other words, and the problem isn't. It might be the case that the federal response was much better than Trump was given credit for. That might be the case. I'm not trying to take the position, but that federal response had to be accompanied by a vigorous rhetoric that made us feel more secure. And so if we're looking to our president to give us that feeling of security in a crisis that was making us all feel fairly profoundly insecure, feel fairly insecure, and instead we got those press conferences, which were tactical in a certain way, but then people, I think, were just waiting for that speech, and it didn't take much. Like the Queen's speech isn't that brilliant. It's just sort of, we'll get through this, Britain, So by failing rhetorically, I'd say he doesn't just fail himself, he fails to fulfill the presidential responsibility to keep us secure, to make us feel secure. He failed in that case to live up to the OT. So, all right, thank you.